I never imagined a lifetime of motherhood could be erased in the space of a single turn signal. Yet there I was, sitting in the passenger seat of my daughter's luxury SUV, the air between us thick with the kind of silence that kills slowly. It was the kind of silence that had weight, shape, intention. A silence sharpened to cut. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 69 years old. I have taught hundreds of students how to analyze poetry, how to hold their own voice steady against the world. But nothing prepared me to defend myself against my own child. Bianca's nails clicked against the steering wheel, rapid, controlled, like she was ticking off a checklist of emotions she preferred not to have. She was 39, polished, successful, a chief strategist in a company that teaches people how to tell stories that aren't true. She had learned her lessons well. "Mom," she said finally, "we need to be realistic. You can't live alone forever. Riverview Haven has a hydrotherapy pool, on-site medical staff, social clubs. It's not abandonment, it's planning." She spoke like a consultant, not a daughter. I looked at her profile, the determined jaw, the perfect skin, the careful hair. I remembered her at 5, laughing with paint on her clothes, declaring strawberries were summer fireworks. I remembered her at 17, trembling because she didn't get the scholarship she thought defined her value. I remembered her at 24, crying on my kitchen floor when Mark left. She used to come to me to be held. Now she came to manage me like I was an inconvenient property deed. "My life is not a liability report," I said. I kept my voice soft. Age has taught me that true authority rarely needs volume. "I have friends, I have routines, I have my independence. You cannot place me in a facility like a winter coat in storage." Bianca inhaled through her teeth, the way she does right before she chooses cruelty. "Independence," she repeated, as if the word were almost funny. "Mom, you leave the stove on. You forget appointments. You get dizzy when you stand up too fast. You don't drive anymore. You need help." "What I need," I said, "is respect." Traffic moved around us, oblivious. The sky was clear. Life continued in every direction except ours. Then she did it. She turned sharply, pulling the car over beside a sun-baked sidewalk. No warning, no gentleness, just decision. She unlocked my door. "If you're truly independent," she said, "then you will be fine. 4 miles. You can walk. You can call a cab. You can do whatever independent people do." I stared at her. "You're leaving me here," I said. Not a question, a fact forming in the air between us. Bianca's face tightened, not with guilt, but with conviction. "This is the only way you'll understand. If I don't set boundaries, you'll never accept help." "Help," I whispered. "Is that what you call this?" She placed my tote bag on the sidewalk. She didn't throw it. She didn't shove me. She simply removed me. Then she drove away. The taillights flickered once, then disappeared into traffic. Heat shimmered off the pavement. A bus sign rattled in the wind. My phone was at 3% battery. My wallet was sitting on my kitchen table where I had set it while watering my violets, thinking I would be back in an hour. I stood there, an old woman beside a sun-stained bench, holding the echo of my daughter's righteousness. There is a particular humiliation that comes from being dismissed by the very life you created. It is surgical. It cuts through bone and memory. And yet, beneath the shock, beneath the sting, something else stirred in me. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper, cleaner. Clarity. If my daughter believed I could not stand on my own, then perhaps she had forgotten the woman who raised her, the woman who worked 3 jobs after her father died, the woman who kept the house warm, the meals cooked, the bills paid, the nightmare of grief from swallowing us both whole. Perhaps Bianca believed I had grown small. I stood. I straightened my back. I began to walk. I did not know that my steps that day would lead me to a stranger in a pale suit, a man who would change the course of everything, a man whose secrets would unravel mine, a man whose illusions would mirror my own. But I knew this much. Humiliation is not the end of the story. It is the hinge on which power can turn. If you're watching this video, please support the channel by liking and subscribing. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Not to judge, just to understand how people think. If someone you love tried to control your life for your own good, which response feels more true to who you are? A. Stay silent to keep the peace, even if it hurts. B. Stand your ground, even if your voice shakes. Tell me, honestly, A or B? I had taken no more than 12 steps from that bus stop when I heard a voice low, warm, shaped like a memory I could not quite place. It did not startle me. It arrived. The way a violin note arrives before you register the instrument. "Excuse me," it said, "but you appear to be in need of company." I turned. A man in a pale linen suit sat quietly on the same bench I had just left behind. His posture was straight, elegant in a way that did not brag. His hair was silver, not the kind that falls untended, but the kind that is kept out of respect for time. He held a slim cane between his fingers, though the cane rested, unused, beside him. Sunglasses concealed his eyes, not as armor, but as a curtain. "I didn't hear you walk up," I said. "I arrived some minutes ago," he replied, "but I am not in the business of intruding on private storms." His voice was gentle, but there was something underneath it, something like comprehension, as if he had seen this scene before, many times, in many lives. I did not answer. Words at that moment felt too thin. He continued, with no urgency, "My name is Leonard. Leonard Ashford." The name did nothing for me then. Later, it would feel like the headline of everything that followed. I gave him my name, though I was aware of how small it felt on my tongue after the scene that had just unfolded. "May I sit with you?" he asked. "You already are," I replied, unable to hide a worn humor that surfaced in spite of myself. He smiled, genuine, not charitable. "Then may I speak to you, Evelyn Hart, as one human being to another, without assuming anything of your situation?" "Yes," I said. "You have just experienced an act of control disguised as concern," he said. "A very common cruelty in families who believe love gives them the right to rearrange another person's life." The words were scalpel precise, not comforting, not pitying, simply accurate. "And," he added, "you did not crumble. You simply absorbed it. That is why I am speaking to you, and not merely observing. Strength seeks recognition." I should have bristled. I should have protested his familiarity, but instead something loosened inside me. Like a locked room whose handle had been tried for years, had suddenly been turned by someone who understood its mechanism. "Are you always this direct?" I asked. "I have no remaining patience for the acrobatics of politeness," he said. "When one has lived long enough, truth is the only courtesy that holds value." I looked again at the cane, the sunglasses, the unerring orientation of his head toward mine. "You're blind," I said, not as a question. "I am perceived to be," he answered, and that phrasing hung as delicately as lace. Perhaps it was meant to. Perhaps it was habit. A car approached, then a dark sedan, polished enough to mirror the sky. The driver stepped out. He was older, composed, carrying presence the way some men carry tools. He opened the back door and waited. Leonard rose carefully, his movements controlled not by frailty but by deliberation. He lifted his cane, but did not lean on it, not even slightly. He turned toward me again. "If you will permit it, allow my driver to take you somewhere of your choosing. You are overheated, unsteady, and you should not walk 4 miles in this weather." The phrasing "allow my driver" was not boastful. It was simply factual, like informing someone that water is wet. I hesitated. He continued softly, "I am not rescuing you. I am offering a civilized option in an uncivil moment. You do not owe me conversation, only acceptance of ease where it is reasonable." It was the first time in a long time someone had spoken to me without implying debt. "Where would you take me?" I asked. "Wherever you wish," he said. Then, after the briefest pause, "Though I would suggest tea first. The spirit settles better when the hands are occupied." This should have been the moment I refused. Every sensible story warns of strangers, invitations, vulnerability. But there are moments in life when logic is irrelevant, when instinct, honed across decades of being human, speaks with the clarity of water. And my instinct said, "This man is also carrying something heavy." I let the driver, whose name he introduced as Porter, offer his arm to steady me as I entered the car. I did not feel small. I felt acknowledged. Inside, the air was cool, holding the faint fragrance of cedar and something like bergamot, not luxury displayed, but comfort maintained. Leonard settled beside me with the ease of a man who had practiced the act of sitting elegantly, not for appearance, but because life feels better when performed with care. We did not speak for several minutes. The city blurred past. My heart settled not into peace, but into awareness. Finally, he said, "It is a terrible thing to be treated as if you have already ended while you are still here." I exhaled. A long, slow surrender of the breath I had been holding since the car door had shut on Bianca's certainty. "Yes," I said. "Your daughter," he continued, "believes that independence is the absence of need, but independence, real independence, is simply the ability to choose whose hands you entrust your moments to." Something tightened in my chest, not pain, but recognition. The car turned. Trees rose. A shape of a house came into view, elegant, quiet, not ostentatious. But I knew without knowing that whatever lay inside it was not ordinary. I looked at him, at the cane that had not once been necessary since he stood up. "Leonard," I said slowly, "can you really not see?" He turned his face toward mine. "That," he said softly, "is a story that requires tea." And just like that, I crossed the threshold into a life I had not expected, but perhaps had been walking toward for years. Not because I was weak, not because I was lost, but because I had been seen, not managed, not controlled. Seen. And that is where everything begins. The car moved along a quiet boulevard where the houses grew larger and the sidewalks disappeared. The city noise faded behind us, replaced by long stretches of lawn that looked too manicured to be touched by real weather. When the sedan slowed, I felt the shift in atmosphere before I saw the house itself. The Ashford estate did not announce itself with extravagance. It did not need to. It sat with the confidence of something that had existed long before admiration was invented. A long row of sycamores framed the driveway like a procession. Their leaves whispered the way confidences are shared between old friends. Porter opened the door for me, and I stepped out into a quiet that felt curated, like a museum of stillness. The air smelled of jasmine and something faintly mineral, perhaps water from the stone fountain in the center of the courtyard. The fountain did not roar, it murmured. Everything here was calibrated, nothing unnecessary spoke. Leonard exited the car with the same composed slowness I had seen before, not hesitation, deliberation, as though he believed every gesture deserved intention. He did not fumble for obstacles, though there were several: uneven cobblestone, a shallow step. His cane touched the ground in front of him, but it did not bear his weight. It tapped like punctuation. A statement being made to someone not me, not Porter, not the world, perhaps himself. The front door opened before anyone knocked. A woman stood there, tall, linen dress, hair pulled back, expression trained into courtesy so practiced it was nearly a reflex. Not warmth, professional softness. She nodded at Leonard, then at me. She did not ask who I was. That told me everything. Guests here were not unexpected. They were anticipated. "Tea," Leonard said, as if the word itself were an agreement already finalized. We walked through rooms that looked like someone had arranged light rather than furniture. The ceilings felt impossibly high, the floors wide and soft in their silence. Art filled the walls, not loud, not demanding interpretation, but confident in its existence. I noticed there were no photographs, not of family, not of history. Only curated memory in the form of paintings and sculpture. A conservatory opened at the rear of the house, glass walls rising upward to meet the sky. Greenery thrived there, but not wild, not lush, exact. Plants placed as if chosen not simply for their appearance, but for what they communicated about patience and endurance. We sat at a small round table of white stone veined with gold. The tea arrived in porcelain cups so thin I could almost see the shadow of my fingers through them. The scent, bergamot, and something floral rose and settled around us like the reopening of a curtain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Silence, when respected rather than feared, becomes a kind of language. Leonard folded his hands lightly on the table. "There is a particular kind of exhaustion," he said finally, "that comes from performing a life rather than living it." I looked at him. The sunglasses remained, shielding his gaze from mine, but the tilt of his shoulders, the way his breath moved, told me more. "You're not talking about me," I said. "No," he agreed. "Not only you." I took a sip of the tea. It was warm enough to center me, strong enough to steady something inside that had been shaking since the street. I felt myself begin to see the room as more than just a beautiful space. It was a sanctuary and a prison. Beauty can be both. A figure entered, then quiet footsteps, deliberate presence. A woman, perhaps in her 40s, tall, composed. Her resemblance to Leonard was unmistakable. The same posture, the same careful economy of movement, the same vigilance behind gentility. "Father," she said simply. The word carried weight, not endearment, not accusation, something between duty and concern. He inclined his head slightly. "Celeste," he said. Then, without flourish, "This is Evelyn." She offered her hand to me. When I took it, her grip was firm. She looked at me not as one looks at a stranger, but as one evaluates an element in an equation. Not hostile, not welcoming, measuring. "I trust your visit is comfortable," she said. "I have only just arrived," I replied. "Ah," she said, though the word did not acknowledge. It assessed. Her gaze shifted to her father. "Porter informed me. I assumed you would want to be notified." "I do not require notification of my own decisions," Leonard said softly. Not sharply, just true. Something passed between them, an old conversation, one they had repeated many times in many forms. It was not conflict. It was inheritance. Celeste nodded but did not retreat. She stood for a moment longer, making her presence known, and then walked away with the grace of someone trained in how to exit a room as effectively as entering it. When she was gone, I exhaled. "She worries," Leonard said. "It is her profession." "You mean her job?" I asked. "No," he said. "Her profession. Worrying is something she has cultivated, perfected even. When someone has taken on the role of guardian long enough, it becomes their identity." There was history in that sentence. A long one. I did not ask. I knew enough about wounds to understand that asking too soon can turn vulnerability back into armor. "Do you want to rest?" he asked me then. The question was not about physical fatigue. It was about the emotional architecture of the day, the car, the walk, the abandonment, the strangeness of being seen by a stranger. "No," I said. "I want to stay awake in this moment." He nodded, as if he knew exactly what that meant. The tea continued. The afternoon light shifted. Something in my chest loosened in small increments. Not relief, recognition. For years, I had been living in rooms where I was managed, evaluated, corrected. In this room, I was simply present, equal, not rescued, not patronized, witnessed. When the time came to leave, Porter reappeared with quiet certainty. The car returned me not to the life I had left that morning, but to the one I was beginning to see clearly for the first time. As I stepped out, Leonard spoke, the words floating after me like a promise and a question. "We don't always choose the moment our life changes, but we do choose whether to step into it." I closed the car door gently, as if sealing a new chapter into place. I did not yet know how deeply that moment would change me, only that it already had. The next morning I awoke earlier than usual, as though my mind had not yet returned to the familiar rhythms of my old life. The light through my kitchen window seemed different, sharper, as if the world had shifted by a degree and I had to relearn how to see it. My apartment, once a refuge of modest routines, now felt slightly too quiet, the silence too thin. I brewed my tea the way I always did, but even the aroma tasted changed. I felt watched, not by others, but by my own awareness, now alert in ways I had not known it was capable of. I found myself thinking of the conservatory, the soft glow of glass-filtered sun, the subtle scent of lemon and warmed stone. I thought of the way Leonard's voice had filled the room, not with volume, but with presence. I thought of the way he seemed to remain still without being frozen, calm without being empty. And though I did not want to admit it yet, I thought of the way he listened not to respond, not to correct, but to understand. By midday, a car waited outside my building again, not summoned, not expected, simply there. Porter stood next to it, hands folded behind his back, as though the return had been scheduled in a language beyond calendars. "Mr. Ashford requests your company," Porter said. It was phrased not as an obligation, nor as a favor, but as an invitation extended with dignity. I understood then that dignity, given freely, is more persuasive than urgency. I placed my hand lightly on his offered arm and allowed myself to be guided. This time, when the car pulled up to the estate, I did not feel like a visitor entering foreign territory. I felt as though the house had already accounted for my arrival. The front doors opened before the car came to a complete stop, and the same quiet professional from yesterday greeted us with the practiced nod of a diplomat. The tea room, or perhaps simply the room that had become our place, welcomed us again. A soft tray of pastries rested waiting, not as though prepared for company, but as though meals were always served accompanied by care here. The chairs were the same, though somehow my body settled into them with less hesitation. Leonard entered a moment later, not guided, not cautioned, simply appearing in the doorway as though the house announced him silently. He moved toward the table with sure steps, cane in hand but not in use, and took his seat opposite me. "Welcome back," he said, and the warmth in the words was gentle, unhurried, without expectation. Not surprise, not presumption, recognition. I did not reply immediately. I was learning that silence, in this place, did not need to be filled. Conversation here was not a series of transactions. It was an unfolding. "Finally," I said, "I didn't expect to return." "No," he agreed lightly. "But you are here." A simple statement, yet it carried the weight of a realization I had not yet spoken aloud. I had chosen this. Not out of desperation, not out of loneliness, but out of something that felt like alignment. A door opened behind us, and Celeste stepped in. Her presence entered the room before she did. She did not announce herself. She did not need to. Her gaze slid first to her father, then to me. No hostility, no welcome, simply assessment. "Good afternoon, Miss Hart," she said. I nodded. "Good afternoon." She sat at the table without being invited or excluded. I admired her confidence, though I could feel the wall she wore like an inherited garment. She poured herself tea, the motion neat and exact. No shaking, no hesitation, ritual, strictly observed. "My father tells me you are a teacher," she said, though her tone implied this was not new information. "I was," I said, "for most of my life." "And now?" she asked. I held her gaze. "Now I am deciding what the rest of my life should look like." A muscle in her jaw twitched. Recognition, or perhaps envy. "So many people your age avoid that question," she said. "They cling to what they know, even when it no longer serves them." "Comfort," I said, "can be another form of captivity." Her eyes flickered, surprised not by the sentiment, but by how simply it had been spoken. Leonard listened without interrupting, and I realized that our conversation was not a test of worth. It was a negotiation of presence. Celeste and I were not adversaries. We were two women who had spent our lives carrying others, learning to survive by holding rather than being held. "Would you like to walk?" Leonard asked when the tea had cooled. It is easier to speak while moving. Words breathe differently in the open air. We made our way to the garden. The sun had softened into late afternoon, and the air carried the scent of rosemary. The garden was not extravagant, no exotic blooms, no ornate fountains. It was simple, cultivated for peace rather than display. Stone paths curved like thoughtful sentences. We walked slowly, not because age demanded it, but because the garden seemed to request it. "I imagine you are wondering," Leonard said as we passed a row of lavender, "how I navigate this place so comfortably." "I am," I admitted, but I decided not to ask yet. "That," he said, "is why I am willing to answer." We stopped beneath an archway of wisteria. "I learned this house long before the world knew me as blind," he said. I did not adapt to blindness. Blindness adapted to me. It was not a confession. It was a key, handed slowly. I did not ask more. Some truths require time to ripen. Celeste watched us from a distance, arms crossed lightly, posture steady, gaze unreadable. She was guarding something, not him, not the estate, but the fragile equilibrium of a life built around one concealed truth, the truth that Leonard had not yet revealed, the truth that would change everything. We returned to the conservatory as dusk began to gather. The glass walls shifted from transparent to reflective, turning the room into a place where interior worlds appeared alongside external landscapes. As we sat once more, Celeste spoke, her voice softer now. "My father has survived because he chose who to let close," she said. "Be sure you understand what is asked of you, if you choose to remain part of his world." Her caution was not a threat. It was a warning born of love. Or fear. Perhaps both. I met her gaze steadily. "I have spent most of my life being managed. I have no interest in being managed again." She nodded. Just once. Not in approval, but in recognition. "I respect that," she said quietly. Night settled slowly, without fanfare. And I understood, without needing to be told, that the story unfolding here was not one of rescue or romance or gratitude. It was a story about seeing what others have hidden, and being seen in return. The invitation arrived the next afternoon, delivered in a thick cream envelope sealed with deep blue wax. My name was written by hand, the script elegant and unmistakably deliberate. Porter did not explain. He simply placed it in my hand and waited for instruction. But the envelope already felt like a continuation of what had begun in the conservatory, in the garden, in the quiet space where silence had formed its own language between us. Inside, the card read, "An evening gathering at the Ashford Cultural Foundation. Your presence would be valued. Formal attire recommended." There was no date because it was understood to be tonight. I stood for several moments holding the invitation, its simplicity more persuasive than any elaborate reasoning could have been. I knew this was not simply an event. This was a crossing. A shift from private encounter to public acknowledgement, subtle though it might be. And choices like this, though they appear small, change entire lifetimes. When evening arrived, a gown waited in a box at my door. Midnight-colored silk, understated and graceful, with a single narrow line of silver beading at the waist. There was no note. Yet I knew whose choice it was, and I understood the message. "I see you." Not in the way the world sees, but in the way one recognizes something familiar in another's strength, withheld grief, unspoken resilience. When I arrived at the foundation hall, the building glowed like a lantern in the dusk, tall glass panels reflecting soft golden light. The doors opened before I reached them, and when I stepped inside, the world changed shape. The air carried warmth, low music, and the muted conversations of people accustomed to being listened to, the kind of people who made decisions that shaped cities, industries, sometimes countries. Their movements were smooth, intentional, guarded. Yet the moment I entered, those conversations shifted, ever so slightly, as though a stone had been dropped into a still reflecting pool. Leonard stood near the center of the hall, posture relaxed, cane held lightly but not leaned upon. He wore a dark tailored suit that flattened the lines of time and drew attention to the steadiness of his presence. No glasses tonight, not yet. His eyes were uncovered, unhidden, unmasked. They were focused, not outward, but inward, as though the effort of wearing sight invisibly had left a mark. But the moment he heard my footsteps, something in him lifted, not visibly, not theatrically, but the way a locked window opens when someone finally remembers the latch. "Miss Hart," he said, voice warm enough to land softly, but audible enough for those nearby to hear. Not whispered like a secret, spoken like an introduction. I felt eyes move toward us, curiosity sharpening. Not scandal, not judgment, not yet, only interest. I placed my hand lightly on his arm, not as support, not as guidance, but as acknowledgement. "Thank you for inviting me," I said. "Thank you for coming," he replied. And for a moment, we simply stood, not rushing to speak, not rushing to move. It felt like the space itself adjusted around us. Then the evening began. We moved slowly around the hall, meeting dignitaries, curators, philanthropists, board members. Leonard's tone was graceful, measured, and when he spoke of the Foundation's work, it was with the clarity of someone who believed in the purpose beneath the institution. But as we walked, I noticed details others did not. The way Leonard turned his head toward a sculpture before someone mentioned it. The way he stepped aside before a server approached, without being prompted. The way he lifted a glass before the tray had fully reached him. The signs were subtle, ordinary to anyone else. But to someone who had once studied human behavior for a living, not for profit, but to pull meaning from minds forming themselves, it was unmistakable. He could see. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not without strain, but he could see. And yet the charade of blindness was not arrogance or manipulation, it was protection, a barrier, a story that kept the rest of the world at a distance, a carefully built shelter. But now here, in this room full of observing eyes, I was the only one who saw the truth. At one point, we paused near a large painting, a sweeping abstract of oranges and deep green strokes, like rust and forest pressing against each other. "What do you see when you look at this?" Leonard asked. The question was casual, gentle, but I heard the weight beneath it. "I see something struggling to become whole," I said, "something torn between what it once was and what it is becoming." His breath shifted, not a sigh, not surprise, more like recognition. "Most people describe the technique," he said softly, "not the becoming." "Most people aren't becoming anything," I replied before I could stop myself. He laughed, not loudly, not dismissively. It was the kind of laugh that holds truth in it. "Walk with me," he said. He guided us to a quieter gallery, where glass walls overlooked the city. Below, lights flickered like constellations rearranged into new shapes. "You noticed," he said. I did not pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." "My daughter worries what will happen if others notice," he said. "The questions, the scrutiny, the power shifts, the rumors." His hand rested lightly on the railing, fingers steady. "I spent years protecting what I love by hiding a part of myself. I am no longer certain that was the right choice." I could have asked why he told me this. I could have asked what he wanted me to say. I could have asked what he was afraid of. But I asked the one question that mattered. "What do you want your life to look like now?" He turned toward me not carefully, not calculatingly, but wholly. No barrier, no mask. "I want to live it," he said, "not manage it." For a moment the world felt suspended, not paused, not frozen, just held, and then the sound of footsteps approached. Celeste. Her expression held no hostility, no fear, something else, something closer to acceptance, worn at the edges by caution. "Everyone is waiting for your remarks," she said to her father. "Then to me," she added quietly, "please stand with him, it will matter." Not for image, not for reputation, but because she understood finally that I had seen him and chosen not to leave. "I will," I said. And this time, I meant it not as agreement to attend a gathering or to share tea in a sunlit room. I meant it as a promise. A beginning. Even knowing the world would soon demand explanations. Even knowing that becoming is often the hardest part of living. The room where the speeches were held was arranged like a theater disguised as a salon. Rows of chairs curved toward a small dais, and soft lighting created the impression of intimacy even among 100 watching eyes. When Leonard stepped forward to speak, the crowd shifted in a single collective breath, the way people reposition themselves without realizing they are doing so, not in anticipation, but in deference. This was not the kind of authority that could be purchased or inherited by lineage alone. It was something earned slowly, shaped by choices that others could only guess at and sacrifices that remained unnamed. I stood beside him, not touching, not presented, simply beside. And though I felt the weight of attention from the room, it did not feel like scrutiny. It felt like awareness. Like the air recognized that something in the familiar structure had changed. Leonard spoke of the foundation first, of scholarships and grants and the quiet strength of art to shift the human mind toward empathy. His voice was low, steady, But there were moments, small ones, where the timbre of his tone deepened, as though drawing from a memory stored carefully out of sight. Then his voice shifted subtly, like the soft turn of a key. "There is a question I have asked myself for many years," he said. "What does it mean to live honestly when the world demands performance? And what does it cost us when we answer to the world instead of to ourselves?" The room stilled. Even the waitstaff paused mid-step. This was not foundation speech. This was confession spoken in the language of philosophy. "Most of us do not realize how much we hide," he continued, "until we meet someone who sees us clearly." He did not turn toward me. He did not need to. The awareness of the room sharpened anyway, like a whisper traveling through a crowd without being spoken. He ended without flourish. No dramatic pause, no emphatic gesture. The silence afterward lingered just long enough to be felt, then dissolved under a wave of courteous applause. As people stood and began to circulate, I sensed a shift in the undercurrent of conversation. Observers now sought context, history, explanation. It is human instinct, after all, to understand the shape of change. Celeste approached us, her expression carefully composed. But there was something loosened in her gaze tonight, not softened, but less braced. "Would you walk with me?" she asked quietly. Leonard nodded once, granting space, though the understanding between us was unspoken. What passed between his daughter and me now mattered deeply. We stepped into the gallery corridor, where moonlight fell through tall glass panels and the paintings glowed in muted tones. For several moments, neither of us spoke, the silence full but not heavy. "My father has always been a man divided between two worlds," Celeste said finally, "the world he allows others to see and the world he carries within." Her voice did not tremble, but it held an ache that was old, layered, and carefully maintained. "When my mother died, everything changed," she continued. "I was 16, old enough to understand grief, too young to understand how grief rearranges the living." She stopped walking. Her hand touched the back of a nearby chair, grounding herself. He stopped looking at us directly. He stopped looking at anything directly. At first, the doctors believed it was a neurological response to shock. Later, they called it functional blindness. Trauma manifesting in the brain. But time passed, and his condition remained unchanged, or so we believed. She turned to me then, meeting my gaze fully. "It took me years to realize that he sees more than people think, perhaps not as sharply, perhaps not consistently, but he sees, and he chose to allow the world to believe he could not." I did not react aloud. Quiet understanding was the only respectful answer. "He valued privacy above power," Celeste continued. "But power came anyway. Influence, control, wealth. People did not question a blind man who gave generously. They admired him. And I protected that admiration because it was all he had left that remained untouched by grief." There was no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion long lived in. "He is not a man who fears the world," she said. "He fears losing what little remains of the life he once shared with her. The blindness became a boundary he could hide behind, and I became the one who guarded that boundary." Her gaze searched mine with quiet precision. "You must understand something. I do not fear your presence in his life. I fear what it will expose. Once the world knows he sees, everything will change. Legal agreements, corporate structures, board influence, inheritance assessments. Power dynamics will shift so fast it will be violent. And people who once praised him will question every choice he has made for the last 15 years. There it was, the secret beneath all the others. Not jealousy. Not possession. Fear of the collapse of an equilibrium she had spent half her life maintaining. "He trusts you," she said. "Not because you offered comfort, not because you were kind, but because you did not treat him as though he were broken." Something inside me tightened, something painful, something familiar. "I know what it means to live behind someone else's idea of who you are," I said quietly. "I know what it is to be managed, to be spoken for, to be handled. I have no intention of repeating that role." Celeste exhaled slowly, as though releasing a breath she had held for years. "I needed to hear that," she murmured. We walked back together, not as adversaries, not as allies, but as two women who had each carried a life they did not choose and learned to survive it. Leonard stood where we had left him, but now his sunglasses had returned, covering his eyes once more, the mask restored. Not for himself, for the safety of the world around him, the one that was not yet prepared for the truth. As I stepped beside him, he did not take my arm, nor did I offer it, but the space between us felt claimed. Not publicly, not romantically, but undeniably. Later, as the guests began to depart, whispers followed us, not sharp with curiosity now, but softened with understanding. Something had shifted tonight, not loudly, not visibly, but irrevocably. And it was not only Leonard's world that was changing. It was mine too. Because once you see someone's truth and they see yours, you can no longer return to the life you lived before. In the days that followed the foundation gathering, something subtle yet unmistakable shifted inside me. It wasn't excitement, nor was it the dizzying flutter of new attachment. It was steadier, quieter. Like discovering a room inside myself that had always been there, but whose door I had never opened. I moved differently through my small apartment now, not with urgency, but with a kind of listening awareness. The walls seemed less confining, the rooms less lonely. And yet, the life I had lived before felt like clothing I had outgrown without realizing it. On the third morning, I found myself dialing a number I had memorized decades before. Grace answered on the second ring, her voice warm and textured, like old wood polished many times. She had once been my colleague at the school. Years before retirement had scattered us into our separate routines. We had taught literature side by side, walked through winters and summers of adolescent chaos, and shared the quiet recognition of lives lived mostly for others. "Evelyn?" she said. I could hear her smiling through the line. "It's been too long." I didn't realize until the moment I heard her voice how much I needed it. Not comfort, not advice, recognition. "Do you have time today?" I asked. "For you," she said simply. "Of course." We met at the small garden cafe near the river, the one with mismatched chairs and ivy that crawled along the brick walls. The afternoon light was soft, and the air cool enough to hold our breaths in stillness. Grace looked older, yes, but in the way trees age, fuller, rooted, weathered into a shape that made sense. I sat down across from her, and before I had even spoken, she reached across the table and took my hands. "What happened?" she asked, not with alarm, but with the knowing of someone who has shared enough of your history to feel its echoes. I didn't speak of the abandonment at the bus station. Not yet. That pain was still too raw, like a bruise that deepened each time I looked at it. Instead, I began with what came after, the estate. The conservatory. The voice that seemed to carry not authority, but quiet truth. The way I felt seen not as a burden, not as an obligation, not as someone aging into invisibility. Grace listened without interrupting, the way one listens to a piece of music rather than a story. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, studying me with a kind of gentle astonishment. "You're alive again," she said. The simplicity of the statement struck deeper than any explanation could. I felt tears rise, not grief tears, but the kind that appear when you realize how long you have lived without being known. "I didn't know I had stopped," I whispered. "Most people don't," she replied, "until something or someone reminds them." There was no implication of romance in her tone. She was speaking of awakening, of emergence. But then her expression shifted, and her voice lowered slightly. "And your daughter?" The wound pulsed instantly. I looked down at our hands, still touching. "She left me," I said softly. "Left me on a bench, outside a facility I never agreed to live in, as though my life was already over." Grace closed her eyes for a moment, the way one does when receiving news that is both shocking and deeply unsurprising. In the quiet way life reveals cracks over time. "You always protected her," she said, "even when she did not protect you." I nodded. I thought love meant endurance. "And now?" I breathed slowly. "Now I am learning that love without respect is not care, it is consumption." Grace squeezed my hands, then released them slowly. "So what will you do?" The question hung between us not as pressure, but as possibility. "I don't know yet," I admitted, but I know I cannot go back to who I was before." Grace smiled, not encouragingly, not with false optimism, but with the recognition of a threshold crossed. "Then you won't," she said. "Once the heart wakes, it does not go back to sleep." We sat for a while, speaking of small things, old students, books we had meant to read, winters we lived through together. But beneath every word, I felt the steady warmth of a truth I had not allowed myself to feel in years. I was not alone, not in the world, not in the moment, not in the unfamiliar unfolding of my life. When we finally stood, Grace drew me into her arms. Her embrace was not delicate, it was strong, steady, rooted. "Wherever this takes you," she murmured, "let it take you fully." I walked home slowly, my steps unhurried. The evening air tasted of autumn, of endings and beginnings folded into the same breath. And as I opened the door to my apartment, I did not feel the familiar hollowness waiting inside. I felt presence, not physical, not imagined, but embodied in the fact that my life had weight again, texture, direction. Later that night, when the phone rang, I knew who it was before I answered. "Good evening," Leonard said, his voice warm and unforced. "Good evening," I replied. There was a pause, not hesitation, but shared stillness. "Tell me how you are," he said. And I did. Not because he asked, but because I wanted to. As I spoke, I realized something with quiet clarity. This connection, whatever it would become, was not about replacing the daughter who had abandoned me. It was not about filling the space of grief or loss or betrayal. It was about stepping into a life where I was allowed to exist fully. Not as a role, not as a burden, but as myself. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The late autumn sun had taken on that particular golden shade that arrives only briefly each year, when daylight carries the memory of summer yet speaks the language of winter. I found myself drawn again to the Ashford estate, not out of obligation, and not because I had been summoned. I went because something within me was learning to move toward warmth instead of enduring coldness. And I was beginning to understand that this too was a choice. Porter greeted me at the door, but Leonard was already waiting near the corridor that led toward the conservatory. It struck me how he always seemed to know exactly when I arrived, not by sound, not by routine, but as though attuned to my presence. The sunglasses remained today, the familiar mask, but there was no distance in the way he held himself. "Walk with me," he said. No request, no command, a simple invitation. We moved through the long hallway of windows, where sunlight spilled across polished floorboards and the faint scent of orange blossoms drifted from an unseen source. The air felt suspended, like a held breath. "I wanted to ask you something," he said after a while, his voice quiet but steady. "When she left you, your daughter, did it feel final, or did some part of you still hope she might turn back?" The question did not wound, it unlocked. "I have asked myself that," I said. At first, I thought I was waiting for her to realize what she had done, to feel remorse, to return and apologize. "And now?" he asked. "Now I understand that I was waiting for permission to forgive myself," I said. "Not her. Myself. For loving someone who could not love me without condition, for staying too long, for believing I had to earn my place in her life." We reached the conservatory then, and the glass ceiling was washed with pale gold. Leonard stood very still, his hands resting lightly on the back of a nearby chair. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was recognition spoken without words. "My mother loved me fiercely," he said, "and sometimes I wonder whether her love was also a kind of grief. She wanted a life for me that the world did not allow. And when that life was taken from her, she broke in a way no one could see. My father lost her before she died." I turned toward him. He rarely spoke of his past. This was not rehearsal, this was unveiling. "When I lost my wife," he continued, "I recognized the same fracture, the same quiet collapse. Not all grief is loud. Some of it is simply surrender." His hands tightened ever so slightly on the chair. I could not look at the world after that, not directly. The light hurt, the colors hurt. Everything reminded me of what I had lost, and so the world believed I could not see. It was easier than telling them I could no longer bear to. The words lingered, and I understood the truth beneath them with sharp clarity. His blindness had not been deception. It had been refuge. A door closed against a world that demanded movement after heartbreak had made stillness the only safe place. When he finally turned his face toward the light filtering through the glass, I saw not weakness, but the unbearable strength of someone who had carried grief quietly for so long that it had become the language of his existence. "Do you still see her when you close your eyes?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "every day, and that is why I have begun to open them." Something inside my chest tightened, not in pain, but in recognition. We were two people learning how to come back into our lives after having stepped out of them for too long. I moved closer, not to touch him, but to stand with him in the shared space of honesty. "You are not returning to who you were before," I said. "That man no longer exists. You are becoming someone new." He nodded slowly. "And becoming is harder than remaining broken. It requires choosing the world again." We sat then, not across from one another, but beside each other, looking out toward the trees beyond the glass. Leaves fell on the other side of the windows, drifting in slow spirals. The silence was no longer separation. It was shared belonging. "I do not know what this is between us," he said, "but I know it is not obligation, and I will not allow it to become another mask, for either of us." "It won't," I said, "because we are not building something to protect ourselves. We are building something to live from." He breathed a real breath, deep and unguarded. A breath of someone remembering the shape of hope. We stayed like that for a long time, and I realized something I had not fully understood before. Healing does not arrive as a grand revelation. It comes quietly, in the moment when you find yourself no longer bracing for pain, when your body no longer prepares for disappointment, when your heart allows warmth to reach places that have been cold for years, when you sit beside someone and do not need to perform your existence to be worthy of being seen. As the light faded, the conservatory grew dim, but neither of us reached for lamps or candles. Some truths are clearest in the half-light, where shadows do not need to be chased away to be understood. When it was time to leave, Leonard walked me to the door. He did not ask if I would return. He did not need to. The question no longer lived between us. "Instead," he said, with a quiet steadiness that felt like the strongest thing in the world, "I am glad you are here, Evelyn." I felt the truth of it settle inside me like warmth after long winter. "I am glad to be here," I replied, not as gratitude, but as belonging. And that night, as I lay in bed, I realized that something had shifted permanently. Not in him. In me. I was no longer waiting for the daughter who had left. I was choosing the life I would walk toward. The call came on a Tuesday morning, when the sky hung low with winter drizzle and the world seemed suspended in muted gray. My phone vibrated where it rested on the kitchen counter, and I saw her name before I heard her voice. For a moment, my breath stopped, not in fear, but in something older, deeper. A memory of being summoned, of being needed without being valued. I let it ring once more before I answered. "Mother?" Her voice was breathless, as though she had run to reach a place only she could name. The sound of her was both familiar and distant, like a song I had listened to too many times to remember whether I ever loved it. "Yes," I said, not warmly, not coldly, simply present. I need to see you." The words wavered, but not with remorse, with urgency. Desperation has its own tone. I recognized it immediately. "Where are you?" I asked. "At your building, downstairs." I looked toward the window. The street below was slick with rain, and there she was, standing near the bench where I used to rest after long walks, a place that once felt like a small refuge. Now it felt like an echo. I made my way down slowly, not to delay but to steady my breath. When I stepped outside, she turned sharply at the sound of the door. Her coat was expensive, though slightly worn at the hem, her hair pulled back too tightly, as though control could fix what was already unraveling. For a moment, we simply stood facing each other. Her eyes flickered over my face, searching for softness, for the version of me who once apologized for inconveniencing her by existing. I did not offer it. "Thank you for coming down," she said. "I live here," I replied gently. Something in her shoulders collapsed a fraction. She was not prepared for conversations without leverage. She took a slow breath. I think I made a mistake. The rain gathered in fine mist around us. A passing car sent ripples through a puddle near her feet. I did not speak. The silence drew her forward. I shouldn't have left you there. I was overwhelmed. I didn't think. Mark was pressuring me. And the doctors. Do you want forgiveness? I asked softly. Or do you want absolution? Her lips parted, confusion cutting through the practiced narrative she had prepared. She had expected tears. She had expected pleading. She had expected the version of me who once would have crawled across glass to keep her close. She did not expect a question. I want us to be a family again, she said finally, voice trembling. I studied her, the way her hands twisted the fabric of her coat, the way her gaze slid away from mine whenever the truth drew too near. What does family mean to you? I asked. She blinked quickly, the way one blinks when a wound is touched unexpectedly. It means support, forgiveness, being there for each other. Was I there for you? I asked. Yes, she whispered. And were you there for me? The silence was not quiet. It rang like a struck bell. Her throat worked. I am trying now. But only now that you need something, I said calmly. Her eyes widened, not in surprise, but in recognition. The truth had been there all along. She had simply hoped I would not say it. She looked away toward the street, where strangers passed unaware, unconcerned. For a moment, she was simply a child again, standing in the doorway with scraped knees, wanting comfort but not understanding how to ask for it. I lost my job, she said at last. Mark left, the mortgage is behind. I don't know what to do. There it was. Not regret. Not love. Need. She had come because her world was collapsing, and she believed mine might bear the weight of her fall. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not triumph, just clarity. A door that once led into pain now led into understanding. You thought I would rescue you, I said softly. Tears filled her eyes, real ones. But grief is not always evidence of love. Sometimes it is simply the body mourning the loss of control. Please, she whispered. I don't have anyone else. I stepped closer not to embrace her, but to see her fully, without illusion. You had me, I said. You had me every year of your life, and you chose to leave me on a bench and walk away. She flinched, not at the words, but at the memory of her own actions. I continued, my voice steady, but not unkind. I cannot return to the version of myself who accepted that, and I will not sacrifice the life I am building now to keep you from the consequences of the life you chose. Her breath caught. So, you won't help me? I will not rescue you, I said, but I will not abandon you. There is a difference. She stared at me, trying to understand, trying to reshape the boundaries she had always believed were hers to set. You may come inside, I said. You may rest. You may eat. You may plan your next steps. And when you stand again, you will stand by your own will, not by mine. She looked at me then with something fragile, unguarded, the first sign of the woman she could become if she chose to. I turned and began walking toward the door. After a moment, she followed slowly, uncertainly. She did not take my arm. I did not offer it. We walked side by side, not as mother and child restored, not yet, but as two women beginning the hard work of truth. At the door, I paused and looked back at the rain-softened street, and I realized something that settled into my bones with gentle certainty. Forgiveness is not a return. It is the decision to stop carrying what was never mine to hold. And I was finally free. Winter settled into the city with a quiet certainty, the kind that does not announce itself with storms, but with a slow, steady cooling of the air, a dimming of the light. The days shortened. The evenings deepened. People hurried more. But inside the Ashford estate, time moved differently, slower, as though it breathed through long corridors and glass rooms that held the memory of warmth. I had not visited in several days, not because I wished to stay away, but because something needed to settle inside me first. The encounter with my daughter had stirred old wounds, yes, but it had also unlocked something long buried, a sense of responsibility to my own life. For so many years, I had believed that my value came from being needed. Now I saw that being needed had cost me myself, and I needed to understand who I was becoming before I stepped back into Leonard's world. On the morning I returned, snow had begun to fall, not heavy, but enough to soften the landscape into something tender. The estate looked touched by silence. Porter opened the door before I reached it, and though he said nothing, his slight nod felt like welcome. Leonard stood in the conservatory, as though he had been waiting, not pacing, not listening for footsteps, simply present. The air inside the glass room was warm, scented faintly with rosemary and winter jasmine. Outside, snow drifted in slow spirals, silent and weightless. When he heard me step forward, he turned not sharply, not dramatically, but with the quiet awareness of someone who does not need sight to recognize the shape of another's presence. "You've returned," he said. It could have been a question. It could have been a statement. It was both. "Yes," I said, and the word carried everything that had changed. There was no embrace, no attempt to close distance. The closeness already existed. We sat, not across from one another, but side by side again, looking out through the glass at the falling snow. "I saw my daughter," I said quietly. He did not react with concern or inquiry. He waited, in that patient way that made space instead of filling it. "She wants help," I continued, "but she does not yet want to understand what she did or who she has become. She wants rescue, not responsibility." Leonard nodded once, his expression thoughtful rather than sympathetic. "And what did you choose?" "I chose myself," I said. The words sounded unfamiliar in my mouth, not because they were untrue, but because they were new, like a language I was only beginning to speak. His hand rested lightly on the table near mine, not reaching, not asking, simply there. "There is a grief that comes when we stop trying to earn love," he said, "but there is also freedom." "Yes," I said, "both, at once." We sat in companionable quiet, watching the snow accumulate against the glass. The world felt suspended, not paused, but quietly rearranging itself. He took a slow breath, and I could feel the weight of what he was about to say long before the words formed. "There will come a time when the truth of my sight is no longer something that can remain unspoken," he said. "People have begun to notice. They are curious, and curiosity becomes scrutiny. Scrutiny becomes story, and story becomes rumor." I turned toward him. "You are tired of the mask," I said. "Yes," he replied, "but I am not the only one who must live with the consequences of removing it." I understood. The world was large in its hunger for narrative, and powerful men did not alter their stories without the world trying to rewrite them in return. "You are not asking to be led," I said. "You are asking not to stand alone." His breath left him in quiet relief. "I do not know what comes next," he said, "but I know that whatever it is, it must be lived honestly." We sat again in silence, but this time the silence was not searching. It was shared understanding. Outside, the snowfall thickened, blurring the world beyond the glass. It felt like we were inside a moment held apart from time. After a while, he spoke again. "Do you fear what others will say?" he asked. I shook my head. I have spent most of my life shaping myself around the fear of disapproval, of judgment, of being seen as less than worthy. That fear cost me years. It cost me myself. I will not let it cost me the rest of my life. He turned toward me not with his head, but with his full presence. Then we stepped forward together. It was not proposal, not promise, not declaration. It was agreement. We stood then, not quickly, not ceremoniously, and walked into the main hall where the house opened wide around us. Celeste appeared at the far end of the corridor, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. When she reached us, she did not ask. She simply looked at her father, then at me. "Is it time?" she asked. "Yes," Leonard said. She did not argue. She did not caution. She only nodded slowly, deliberately, as though releasing a burden she had held for far too long. "I will make the necessary arrangements," she said, but before she turned away, she met my gaze and held it not as evaluation now, but as acknowledgement. "Thank you," her eyes seemed to say. Not for rescuing him, but for staying. That night, I returned to my apartment, but it no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of rest. A pause between chapters, not a cage between lives. My daughter slept in the spare room, though we had spoken little since she returned. Healing is not a conversation, it is a rebuilding, and rebuilding requires time and truth. I lay in bed and listened to the quiet. Not loneliness, not emptiness. Quiet. The kind that comes when the heart is no longer bracing for harm. When morning came, the sun rose over a world covered in new snow clean, unmarked, waiting to be walked into. And I understood. Healing is not the return of what was lost. It is the creation of what was missing. And I was no longer afraid to live it. In the end, this was not a story about romance or rescue, nor was it simply a story of loss and recovery. It was a story about awakening. Evelyn had spent years living in the shadow of her own life, believing that love must be earned, that her place in the world depended on how useful she could be to others, and that sacrifice was the price of belonging. When her daughter abandoned her, it shattered the last illusion she had been holding on to. But in that moment of devastation, something extraordinary happened. She began to see herself clearly for the first time. Meeting Leonard did not fill the emptiness she carried, it illuminated it. He, too, had lived behind a carefully constructed mask, shielding his grief behind practiced silence and a world that believed he was something he was not. Their connection did not erase their wounds. It recognized them. And in that recognition, both of them began to soften into a new kind of being, one not based on giving everything away or protecting everything inside, but on standing in the truth of who they had become. Healing did not come in one moment. It came in steps, in quiet conversations, in walking forward even when the world behind them still whispered of pain. And it came in the realization that forgiveness is not returning to what broke us, it is releasing ourselves from the belief that we deserved the breaking. Evelyn did not lose a daughter. She released a role that no longer served her, and in doing so, she made room for something deeper, a life chosen, not inherited from obligation. Sometimes we hold on to relationships, identities, and expectations because we believe that letting go means failure. But the truth is the opposite. Letting go is often the most powerful act of self-respect. You are allowed to choose peace over pain. You are allowed to choose a life that nourishes you. Healing begins when we stop asking others to value us and decide to value ourselves. Notice where you are shrinking yourself to maintain someone else's comfort. Ask whether staying is costing you your joy, your dignity, or your sense of worth. If it is, step back, breathe, and choose yourself. Healing does not require grand decisions. It begins with one choice: to stop abandoning yourself. Have you ever stayed in a relationship or situation longer than you should have because you hoped it would get better? What helped you finally choose yourself? Share your thoughts so others may learn from your experience too. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and tell us where you are listening from. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories just like this one.